we're going to take a journey and we're going to understand who Edward Carpenter is. And for that, we're going to have, we're extremely fortunate actually to have two wonderful speakers today. We've got Sally Goldsmith and we've got Rony Robinson. Sally Goldsmith is a songwriter and broadcaster as well as a poet. She's won many prizes and she's done radio work and songwriting, and she's got 2 Sony Radio Awards. Her pamphlet Singer was chosen by Michael Longley to be a first stage winner in 2008 Poetry Business Pamphlet Competition. She's published widely in Poetry Review, Poetry News, The North, Magma, and also 2006 Avron International Poetry Competition Anthology. So that's Sally, and we have Rony Robinson, who I first met when I started the project. I went and spoke on his show about our project, and since then we've been in touch, and it's just wonderful that we're able to have both Rony and Sally here. Rony Robinson, he's a writer, educationalist, and iconic Sony Award winner, BBC Radio Sheffield daytime presenter. He's written a number of novels, Ted Carp Tradition, published by Hodder, The Beano, and he's also written a number of plays. He's written about Edward Carpenter, the revolutionary poet, as he calls him. He's had a lifelong interest in Edward Carpenter, and one of his plays is titled Edward Carpenter Lives. So I'd really like to welcome both of them and give the stage over to Sally and Rony.
How long would you like?
That's a point.
Half an hour it should be. We can just deliver it however much you want. It could take a whole day because we've been at it a long time. This is where we start.
So we're a sort of double act, really, here today. And we decided to sit here with, we just brought a few books here, which are the actual books written by Carpenter, as well as his biography, which we would really recommend you to read, by Sheila Robotham. It's a great piece of work. Sheila's been interested in him a very long time. And we're really interested to come today because you all have a particular interest in Carpenter and his connections with India and his interest as well in Indian and spiritual life. But I think we all discover our own Carpenters. When Rony and I got together about 12, 13 years ago, we were surprised to discover that we were both really interested in Carpenter. We didn't know this about each other. I had been, as a young woman in the 1970s, interested in feminism and socialism. I went to an evening class, an Inner London Education Authority evening class with Sheila Robotham about social history, and Carpenter came. I thought, this is really interesting. Later I moved to Sheffield and did my own little pilgrimage to his house at Millthorpe. Do you want to describe yours as well?
In a way, when we were talking about coming here today, we thought everybody finds their own Edward Carpenter.
Yes.
And I think this is the exciting thing for everybody here. You will find different bits about him that will intrigue you. It might be how he dressed in his sandals. It might be how he grew his beard. It might be his private life. It might be his interest in religion. It might be the fact he came to Sheffield. There are all sorts. My story with Edward Carpenter starts with my mum, who was a little girl, was a dad, my granddad, was a member of the Independent Labour Party, the ILP. And the ILP used to go out some summer's day like this to Millthorpe, which is a little village on the edge of Sheffield, near Holmesfield, just into Derbyshire, if you've not been there. It's a lovely little place. Carpenter lived there for decades. He had a big house there, and a garden, and a market garden, and the pub was just round the corner. My mum went with her dad and mother to see Edward Carpenter sometime in the 1910, 11, 12 sort of time, and met him. My grandmother talked about Edward Carpenter disapprovingly, saying that he lived with his manservant as if he was his wife, which he did, and he grew potatoes all year round, which we think he did. I knew about Carpenter as a little boy through my mum, and we used to pass the gate that said on it Carpenter House. That's all I knew until I went to university and I had to do a paper for a club about some of the local history I came from. And I researched Edward Carpenter for a whole vacation in those wonderful local studies library in the middle of Sheffield, because the Carpenter Collection was there in those days. The Carpenter Collection, you'll see, is absolutely wonderful. It's a whole man's life, and there's so much that survives, irrespective of the fact he was a very interesting man. So there are things in there like sandals and old smocks that he used to make clothes. There's a lock of his mother's hair, or it was there the last time I was in the archives. And I learned from it a great deal about this strange man. And I was learning about it in 1962. He was virtually forgotten, but I came across a reference to E.M. Forster, being enthusiastic about him. And I came across loads of stuff. I delivered my paper, hardly anybody turned up. And years later, I resumed my interest in Edward Carpenter. I wrote 2 plays about him that went on at the Crucible. I wrote that novel. I'd forgotten that novel, but it was named after Edward Carpenter, because the school in it was a school novel, and I named the school the Edward Carpenter School. And I've been interested in him ever since, and I was delighted when Sally and I were walking around during the foot and mouth thing when we were doing our courting, and we started talking about Carpenter, and it turned out we both met Sheila Rowbottom, and we both had this kind of great interest in him, and we've gone on being interested ever since.
And a lot of people are interested. When we've done talks before, you know, there's a huge constituency of people who are interested in him. You know, the walkers and the countryside lovers turn up. The gay constituency turns up. The socialists, vegetarians, feminists, and now we have this interest in the Indian connection, which I think Sheila didn't do much on, and we certainly don't know so much about. So it's fantastic that you are doing this, because you will be adding to this research, this information about who this man was and why he was interested in the things he was interested in. But we're going to do a quick sort of whiz, really, through some of his life. There's so much of it that it will be a quick whiz. Do you want to start with the Brighton stuff, Rony?
My talks normally start by saying Edward Carpenter was born as seafaring stock in Brighton in 1844, and he died in 1929 in Guildford. He lived to be 85. He spent half his life in Sheffield and in Derbyshire, and he came up here after a life that consisted of. He went to Brighton College. He came from a very posh family. If you go down to his house down in Brighton, it's one of the biggest houses on the edge of Brighton. It's a huge Georgian house with wonderful windows, and they were very posh. And he went to Brighton College, he went to Cambridge University as a mathematician. He had some difficult times there. He became a Church of England Anglican curate, and then he, under F.D. Maurice, who was a socialist Anglican, and then he gave it all up, had a breakdown, came north to lecture middle-class women on stars, he said, and eventually ended up in Sheffield.
Yes, it was sort of like early days of WEA, the University Extension Movement. So he came here to lecture, basically. He was lecturing in astronomy and mathematics, I think, amongst other things. And he travelled around the north.
He lived on Glossop Road for a bit. He had digs just down the road here on Glossop Road. And he came up to the north expecting to find, he hoped to find working class men in particular. Like what Whitman talked about, he wanted to be in the company of a different class and a different sort of man. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, it's all right.
That's it.
Yeah, so he's come up here to do that, and he's travelling around Leeds, Manchester, Sheffield. He likes Sheffield. It's a grim place for working people at that time, of course. You know, the industrialisation of it. But he likes Sheffield. He likes the feel of it, like many of us do. And he does an extraordinary thing, which is that he decides he's not only going to try and mix with his teaching, but he's going to live with working people. So he moves to Bradway, you know, where the Low Edges estate is, around there, but of course, you know, when it was still all farmland, and he moves there to live with a family of, the man from the family is a scythe maker. It's an extraordinary thing for an upper middle class man to do at that time. And he writes to Walt Whitman, I think, Walt Whitman, the great American poet, who he has also visited by this time. But he writes to him from Totley, where he's living as well. He moves to Totley for a short time with this sidemaker's family. I do enjoy this outdoor life and digging potatoes. He's digging potatoes. I never mean to abandon either again. I am living with a man, the best friend I ever had or could think to have, an iron worker, side riveter, and his little family. He often says, I wish Walt Whitman would come over here. Below my window, here is a little wooded bank running down to some water, and beyond again, about 2 miles off, the hilly, undulating line of the Derbyshire moors, from which there comes a breeze, like being near the sea. So he's already getting this feeling that he also, you know, he's beginning to get itchy feet. He actually wants to not only live with working people, but to try and live in a different way. And he thinks about how he can do that. Luckily, he gets left some money by his parents and has this dream that he's going to move out to the country and try to sort of live his new beliefs in a way, that he's going to try and do manual work, be a market gardener, and to actually keep, he's a writer too, he's going to live out there and try and live his politics. Do you want to move on that road?
Towards Democracy, the book of poems, which is his most famous work, though hardly anybody reads it nowadays. This is an edition from a public school library, interestingly enough, rather than a beautiful edition of that. And Towards Democracy, you'll find this, it's all online as well as in the archives. You can go on the internet and you'll find Towards Democracy and the rest, which is like a version of what
It's a lovely little book.
But not, it's a version of Whitman. Whitman with water is how it's described. He publishes the first bit of Towards Democracy. He goes to live at Millthorpe in this, what he calls a cottage. It's quite a big house that he paid for to be built out of the money. Both his parents had just died. And he went to live in what he called a simple life. He wrote a book called The Simplification of Life. And he believed that if you sort of undid industrialisation, I suppose, if you had fewer things, you could live a simple life and you'd live a better life. And he tried to do that out at Millthorpe, actually, for the rest of his life until he went down south again as an old man. But he also got involved, not only with a simpler life out there in this market garden. They sold stuff in Chesterfield Market. He also got involved with the nascent socialist movement in Sheffield. And this, for me, was the key bit of things. It was the key bit of the play, which you missed last week, which was rather wonderful, which was an account of what happened in Carpenter's life in the mid-1880s, when he finds himself not only falling in love with a working man, and it doesn't quite work out, but also being part of this sudden move in Sheffield to change the world by socialism. And it sort of ends at the end of the 1880s with violence on the streets of London. But Carpenter remained interested in the possibility of transforming society as well as living a better life and an easier life himself. His politics are really interesting because he seemed to be able at the same time to be a communist, a socialist, an anarchist, and any other ist you care to name, and he could hold them all at the same time. You can see why when Sally came to him in the 1960s odd, this was a very comfortable way of looking at politics. Politics were personal. They included what you ate and what you did with your animals. They included a sort of pacifism. They included personal relationships and how you lived that out as well. How you organised meetings, how you addressed each other, where women came in, where gay lives came in. Carpenter was able to bring them all together in a way that I think probably looked a bit unusual at the time he was doing it. And he retained his interest, and I suppose I'd begun there by saying about the socialism. They ran a cafe down on Scotland Street, which was the subject of the play. Didn't quite work out, but it was the most interesting thing. Lots of famous people came. And Carpenter wrote his most famous piece of work there, which was it's called a socialist hymn. It's called England Arise, and if you ask Sally right at the end of this to sing it for you, she will. It doesn't often get sung. He edited a book of socialist songs, but he also wrote this song, England Arise, the long, long night is over, faint in the east, behold the dawn appear, out of your evil tale of toil and sorrow, arise, O England, for the day is here. And it's a sort of revolutionary song which people went on singing for long after his death. You may have sung it yourself.
But I suppose the other thing that you may be interested in is that I think Carpenter, and this is where, you know, somebody like George Orwell, who wrote very rude things about Carpenter, you know, that he was a sandal-wearing, sort of vegetarian, creeping Jesus. He was, you know, he was also interested in, as Rony said, how you live your life. But he also was a spiritual person. He had been this Church of England curate. He rejects that. He doesn't quite reject spiritual life. And when his mother dies in 1881, he reads the Bhagavad Gita, and himself has a spiritual experience, a sort of transcendental experience, I think. He's come out of this long depression. It's very important to him. He writes Towards Democracy, this long, rather ecstatic book in verse. It's not, bits of it are really nice. In general, I don't think it's brilliant poetry. He's trying to emulate his guru Whitman from America. But he is, it does have this very spiritual feel about it. So although you know, he's involved with the Socialist Society, it's that sort of strand of socialism which perhaps tended to disappear, a socialism that included lots of other things.
Crucially, in our kind of broken down version for the story, the next bit does include India and Ceylon, and he's meeting with a man called George Merrill. There's a sort of, life doesn't work in decades, does it? And dates aren't always the revelatory thing, but there is something that happens to Carpenter out of the experience of the growing labour movement in the 1880s. And there are two really crucial things that happen. One is that he travels to Ceylon in India.
Through his friend.
Through his friend.
Yeah.
Do you want to say? He goes there, he writes a book about it called From Adam's Peak to Elephanta, which is one of the Carpenter books I've never read, interestingly enough, though I guess it's going to be a key text for people who are on this journey. And he goes, and he's a whole load of things he finds from, what would you say, from the East. He's meditated before, he's interested in...
He's interested in meditation. Of course, the famous thing that people often know about Carpenter is he dressed strangely. And he always wore sandals.
You can't see them on this photo, but that's him up there. And
yeah.
Below where his long stockings are, he's wearing sandals.
And he got the idea of these sandals from a pair of Indian sandals. A pair, look, with socks, I'm afraid. He got the idea, I think, from his Ceylonese friend, who brought back a pair of Indian sandals. And he learned with various people that he lived with to make these sandals. And I think as well, if you go to the archives, you'll find that he drew round, because of course he was an attractive person to lots of writers and thinkers, so lots of people came to Millthorpe to see him. E.M. Forster, George Bernard Shaw, all these people came, Havelock Ellis, and in the archives you'll find patterns of their feet drawn round. They were going to make sandals for him. So there's that influence as well, isn't there?
Bernard Shaw wore some sandals when he came to visit Carpenter, and they made his feet bleed. He made a great deal about that. It's interesting that Bernard Shaw, in some ways, is a similar figure, though he mocked Carpenter. And if you look at Candida, the play, the vicar is clearly based on Carpenter, though they were mates, but his sandals made his feet bleed.
Yeah. So he's living out in Millthorpe, And it's extraordinary. Sometimes people call it a commune. It wasn't really. He lived there, first of all, the side maker in his family moved out there with him. And I think probably did more of the digging than he did. He lived then next with a man called George Adams and his family. Lots of them called George. It's very confusing. George Adams and his family, and George became a very good sandal maker and actually taught Harry Brearley, the inventor of stainless steel, how to make them too, which was lovely, and how to mend boots. So there's that funny connection in Sheffield as well. But he lived there with them, and then finally with his long-term life lover, a working class man called George Merrill. So he's living out there, but lots of people are coming to see him. They're getting off the train often at Dore and Totley station, which has been built, been there for some time, 1870s I think, probably that was built. And they're coming out and they're walking across the fields through Totley to Millthorpe. And, you know, Olive Schreiner, who is the famous South African novelist who's trying to write about progressive things at that time. All sorts of people are intermingling, these working class Sheffield people, as well as you know, famous writers and thinkers of the day.
And during the period of the First World War, 1914 onwards, Carpenter was strange at the beginning of the war, it seems to me. He wasn't an outright pacifist at the beginning of the war, though he became something close to one. And what happened out at Millthorpe during that time, it became a place where it was a safe haven to go to if you were on the run, if you were actually if you were a conscientious objector, or if you found yourself coming back from the front and wondering what to do with your life. And I think Siegfried Sassoon stayed with him for a time, yeah, and became, I think, well, his life changed as a consequence of being out there, as indeed many lives have changed as a consequence of being out there at Millthorpe for the weekend, including E.M. Forster. If you ever read a novel called Maurice, there's a wonderful moment about how a weekend at Edward Carpenter's house changed his life. You must read that for yourself. It's a wonderful moment. And Carpenter, Millthorpe was a place to go and a sort of haven to go during the war. By this time he's quite an old man, and in the middle of the 1920s it all kind of goes to pieces really. He's probably quite ill himself. He and George Merrill go down to Guildford. They go to a house they call Millthorpe, or Little Millthorpe, and they live the rest of their lives down there. Merrill dies first. They're buried together in the graveyard at Guildford. They're buried together in the graveyard, in the same grave, which is pretty remarkable, in 1929, I think. Just down from where Lewis Carroll is, the man who wrote Alice in Wonderland. They're in the same graveyard, sleeping together.
But I think probably some of you are quite interested in what this Millthorpe idea, you know, there were this idea of the simplification of life, which again is extraordinary for an upper middle class man. You know, there were these ideas, I suppose, around in the late 19th century about dress reform, you know, not wearing all these corsets and bustles for women, and, you know, his idea about wearing sandals. But he did eat meat, but very, very rarely, and
he drank whiskey, but very rarely.
Yes.
He was a teetotaler.
And he had his piano in the kitchen, which is a rather lovely little touch, to keep his piano in the kitchen.
They used to do nude bathing in the garden.
Nude sunbathing. He believed in the freedom of the, you know, body, and that sunbathing, the sun on your skin was good for you.
He believed the animals in his garden talked. They were going to check the language of chickens. He believed they'd talk. He was against vivisection. And, of course, attracted quite a lot of rather strange people who would come because they saw him as this charismatic man. And he writes quite wryly about this. He writes his autobiography, which is called My Days and Dreams, and it's quite a sort of accessible, but probably not always very truthful account of his life, because he
he makes it a little bit more cosy perhaps than it actually was. But here he's writing about all these visitors who just arrived unannounced. On one occasion, it was when the Fernyhoffs, that's the scythe maker, were living with me. We were sitting quietly at our humble dinner of carrots or whatnot in the middle of the day when I saw two young ladies pass the window. There came a knock at the door and I opened it. There stood a very good-looking, elegantly dressed girl of 23 or 24 with terracotta frock and Gainsborough hat. One said, "Oh, I see you were Mr. Carpenter. You know, I heard you want to speak at the Fabian Society. My cousin and I were near there and thought perhaps we might call. Very glad to see you, I'm sure. And is this really where you carry on your simplification of life? Oh, Madge, isn't it interesting? I don't know about that, but when you come in and sit down, thank you so much, I should be glad of a rest. Will you have a bit of cake and a glass of milk? Oh no, but I should like a piece of dry bread." So the idea of him is something that, you know, the more fanatical, I suppose, of the simplification of life has sort of get hold of. In the 90s, he goes out to India, which I'm hoping you'll discover more about, and writes this book, From Adam's Peak to Elephanta. But he also starts writing about what he calls homogenic love. It's the first, you know, you have to remember that at this time, you know, Oscar Wilde is getting tried for being, for gay relationships. It's quite a brave thing to do at the time. He has trouble publishing it. He's living reasonably openly with his gay lover. He writes several books about that. He writes a book called Love's Coming of Age, which also talks about women and marriage and questioning some of the things that go along with marriage. So I see him as quite a brave character, but when you know, almost in living memory, there are people who have remembered him until recently, very elderly people from Holmesfield Parish, where Millthorpe was. And he seemed to attract quite a lot of loyalty from local people who you would expect, you know, with the gay stuff and the nude sunbathing, to be rather scandalised by him. It's rather a conservative community. But people talk very loyally of him. I think he was probably a very kind man. I think he was a very charismatic man. And of course he was of that class that people might, you know, have some respect for as well. But I think he tried to involve himself in the local community, the local parish council, for example, and was, you know, on very friendly terms with local farmers. There was a local farmer who used to put up people when there were too many people to stay at Millthorpe. So despite what we might see as his rather strange behaviour for the time, he still managed to retain this air of sort of rather eccentric respectability that people have, until recently, have still remembered. Yes.
And Sheila, I think we should have a question or two as well, if we may,
yeah,
to finish us off. But Sheila raises the question in this, I can't recommend this book hard enough. It's also, it's very funny. The more you get into it, the more fun you have with it. Because Sheila loves all the details of all their love lives. And it is really great fun and very celebratory. But Sheila asks the question, it's the question that you will ask as well, about why he keeps getting forgotten. It's what Ian Forster said in 1940, or I think Forster said it when he died as well. Why is it that this man who's so interesting and has so many aspects of his life that are sort of relevant, why does he keep getting forgotten and rediscovered and forgotten and rediscovered? We think we're on the beginning of another rediscovery at the moment, because there's this, and there are other things happening elsewhere. But it's an interesting question you will find you're asking yourself as you find your Edward Carpenter, really. And you'll be puzzling why people still have meetings where people don't know about you. And then they do, and then they don't, and then they do. But good luck with your journeys. It's taken us to some extraordinary strange places in different times. We've met extraordinary people, been in odd rooms with lovely people like this. It's been a great journey for us, hasn't it? So you'll have fun with Carpenter. And you'll have a few laughs as well, actually. But ask us a few things.
And we're quite interested in how you came
Yeah.
to him as well. Why? You know, why did you decide to do this? I think it's great.
Yeah.
Why did he go to India?
When did he go?
Why?
Well, I think...
He was an internationalist. He was interested in more things than most Victorians would have been. But he was... I'm talking over you, I'm interrupting.
No.
It's important to remember that he had some money and it would have been possible for him to travel, and a lot of his life was spent travelling, wasn't it? Although he lived in this community, it wasn't really a community, this place in Millthorpe, he was a man of the world, and he was interested in how other civilizations worked, actually. He wrote a book called Civilization, Its Cause and Cure. He didn't like civilization as it was seen capitalist Victorian. He wanted to find other ways of doing things, and he wanted to travel the world and come back with revelation.
And like Gandhi, you know, Gandhi's famous quote is something like, what do you think about civilization? I think it would be a very good thing. I think, you know, he did meet Gandhi. I'm not quite sure when. You might know. But, you know, that idea of the simplification of life, you know, he was interested in all that. And those early spiritual experiences, his friend from Ceylon, he would have wanted to go there, I think.
Just now I was looking at the book, I mean, different author has written about Edward Carpenter. Actually, the purpose of the journey was in search of own sexuality and Indian tradition, Eastern tradition of homosexuality.
Right.
It is very clearly mentioned. And he has fantasized and metaphorical and that writer's own imaginative journey to that Indian, that culture. And in the current, all the homosexuals' writings are based on that Indian tradition, on the Eastern tradition.
Right.
And he's in search of that, that query, his own sexuality. Since childhood, he was in search of that. And that Indian journey, and starting that Edward picks up, sorry, that name of that book, Edward speak to Elephanta.
Yeah.
It's a long journey from Ceylon to India.
Got it.
And that in search of that journey, he just came down to earth to know that common people, their culture, tradition and everything. And somehow he questioned, and why the Indian revenue should be spent in Britain. Somehow, mind that he is a socialist, at the same time he is anti-establishment, anti-institutional, all those things. And because of, it is that inner spirituality, it's a journey of inner spirituality, it is international.
Yeah.
Whoever in that drive, they have to come down. If you think about Leo Tolstoy, and who was trained before marriage by and married a senior woman to get how to handle that married life and in that system, and he came down to earth and that grows the potatoes and vegetables and you know, that all these things. And that time they used to keep in touch with the Indian, that Tagore or the Gandhi and their simplicity and all, in search of own spirituality, own sexuality. And mind that from early childhood he has got experience about that homosexuality, and he was inclined to that. And in search of the tradition of Indian homosexuality and Eastern homosexuality, that is the journey.
Right, that's your answer
just
there.
now, in support of my thought, I just now turned the page accidentally, incidentally. I have got those lines, it is written there, this book is there.
Right. That's terrific.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But it's okay, we are sharing out, we are enriching
collaboration.
That's why we are here.
Yeah.
Just to share that and discovering our own that Edward.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So it's spirituality and sexuality.
And it's interrelated.
Yeah.
And you know that somehow it is mentioned that his connection with Annie Besant. And in Annie Besant, their idea is to search own sexuality, and Annie Besant's partner used to do virtual masturbation with the young boys in search of their own spirituality, the way of looking at the life, that all the restriction, inhibition created by the institution or organization. to get it from that and find your own existence and own spirituality and homosexuality.
Yeah, great stuff. Well, that's some of the stuff that is fun about Carpenter, isn't it? That side of things. It's
and the side of.
Yeah. And it's the same journey in the sense he'd made to Walt Whitman decades before about the sexuality and the comradeship and all those words that run together. And indeed, I mean,
and that very word was mentioned there. We can, I can find that those pages. That it is the adventure of homosexuality. Either instead of getting actually involved or knowing that particular aspect of human life, because of India has got very ancient tradition. Though there is some hide and seek thing, or not everything, there is some restriction to open it publicly, but still, in search of that, the journey was made.
Thank you.
I also thought that he loved nature.
Yes.
I just read just a few lines up in Niagara. I visited twice Niagara how wonderful it is. And so he discovered a few lines. He said 4 days and 4 nights stayed in Niagara. And a few lines he wrote, they were like, how beautiful it is. So it's so close to nature.
Yes. Wherever he lives.
all right, there's look at that.
And probably the sandal came from Gandhi.
Yes.
Gandhi, no, and he made Gandhi.
It's interesting seeing them both together, isn't it? That's great.
That Carpenter picture is at Millthorpe on his back lawn a bit.
And it's the one that he used to hand out to people, an autograph. Yeah. But that love of nature, you know, wherever he is, I mean, he talks about Sheffield and inner Sheffield as being this dreadful place for working people, but he also describes the moors. He's friendly with a man who lived just outside Sheffield, Burt Ward, who all the ramblers of Sheffield are all really interested in, because he was one of the people who campaigned to open the Peak District to ordinary people to walk. So, you know, there was that connection as well. He, you know, and the spiritual connection, I think, with nature too. Yeah. So that's our gamble through his life, and we are still discovering all these things. Thank you.
Yeah,
Discover more.
We are rediscovering.
Yes,
Edward Carpenter.
Thank you ever so much. Hopefully this is just the beginning for us to work together, because Sally and Rony have both very kindly offered to help us out with the Millthorpe Coach Tour that we're going to have in July as well. So we're going to probably going to have more back and forth conversations. So if we all get reading, and actually you can download Adam's Speak to Elephanta from the University of
There's a lot
Sheffield.
online.
There's a lot online, yeah. It's part of the open publishing initiative, so you can actually look at it. And it's a very fast and quick read, actually. He's laid it out quite well. I've sort of almost finished it, but I don't want to give it away to you, so I won't say anything more about that. I said, I'm listening to both of you. I was just thinking, I was just trying to decide whether he's sort of a loony or he's sort of a mystic in an ashram. So I'm still thinking about both of it. But it just seemed like, you know, we could probably visualize Millthorpe and his life there as an ashram. Perhaps, you know, we'd probably see, we could probably think along those lines and see how far it takes us.
Yeah.
And sort of look at his life through the lens of spirituality, at least from that particular period when he sort of got really influenced by his travels. And because, okay, I'm going to give it a little bit away. Two of the main bits that he writes about, because he extensively looks at the esoteric traditions of East Indian spirituality. So he talks about 2 schools, the Himalayan school and then the South Indian Tamil school. And he visits some of the very key places in South Indian Tamil, because he doesn't get very far, he doesn't get beyond the central part of India, because Elephanta is a reference to the Ajanta, Ellora, the Elephant Cave, so that's the central part of India. So he doesn't get any further than that, he doesn't get to the Himalayan part. But he certainly has explored the Dravidian or South Indian mysticism, because he gets to some of the key temples. He goes to Tanjore, he goes to Chidambaram, he goes to Madurai, which are key places, actually. Fascinating observations of what you see. So it's a major part of his book is that. And then sort of he's got 2 chapters, commentaries on the politics side of it. which is really, really interesting. He talks about old traditions and sort of new influences on the old, where he brings everything together. But we're going to have a book read. Hopefully, Dave Joey is going to help us along, and you guys can help us along as well. We'll talk about it later. But for now, I think we're going to have to have a break. So we'll take about 5. Yeah.
I wonder if there's any chance we could have perhaps just a tiny bit of singing.
Right.
It's dangerous because it's like a lot of Anglican hymns. You start off quite low, but if you start too low, you can't get down any further. And if you start too high, right at the end is a really high note that is deeply embarrassing.
Something rousing.
So we're going to give it a go, but and thank you. Thanks. Anybody else read music as well?
No.
Written in the middle of Sheffield, written in the middle of the industrialisation of Sheffield, in all the smoke and the rain, in a room above a cafe, the Commonwealth Cafe, in Scotland Street in Sheffield, with the sound of the mills and the sound of people going to work and the steelworks, in the middle of the sort of filthiest time of Victorian capitalism in Sheffield. Carpenter wrote this hymn about fields and hills and the countryside and how we must do something about rising again, as it were, getting up early in the morning.
It's often a bit uncomfortable to socialists now because, England arise, it starts to sound a bit, like the far right or something. It wasn't in that spirit at all.
There are 15 verses. How many do you want?
No, there's only 4 in this book.
We'll do the first one, shall we?
Shall we do the first and the last? We'll do the first and the last.
You just hang about. You just get
We'll be in
Oh,
line.
here we go.
Can we withdraw our permission for being recorded?
Sorry, you've got to negotiate that, so you don't have time to do that.
He said, if you know the Anglican carol called Christians Awake, it's a bit similar to that. It's a bit, it was called the song of the coming English Revolution, and it was widely sung alongside the Red Flag and the Internationale.
Until fairly late into the 20th century.
It's still in a hymn book called Songs of Praise, which is used, I think, in some Methodist churches. It's still there, 314.
Yeah. And it's written here in 4 parts as well. So, there was this tradition, I think, in the late 19th century. Well, there was the socialist Sunday school, wasn't there, that your mum used to go to. So there was a tradition of writing socialist songs in the sort of manner of Anglican hymns. So shall I start? I don't know if I'm going to pick the right note to start on.
And if anyone else knows it, you can really
yeah, and I might get it a bit wrong. So we'll do the first, second and last, I think, if we can, unless you're fed up by then.
England arise, the long night is over, faint in the east, behold the dawn appear. Out of your evil dream of toil and sorrow, arise, O England, for the day is here. From your fields and hills of the answer swells, arise, O England, for the day is here. By your young children's eyes so red with weeping, by their white faces aged with want and fear, by the dark cities where your babes are creeping, naked of joy and all that makes life dear. From each wretched slum, let the loud cry come, arise, O England, for the day is here.
Last verse coming
the
up.
final verse, yeah. Forth then, ye heroes, patriots and lovers, comrades of danger, poverty and scorn, mighty in faith of freedom, your great mother, giants refreshing joy's new rising morn. come and swell the song, silent now so long. England is risen and the day is here. And is it interesting that he said, and won't you find it interesting as you go about finding your Edward Carpenters, that the last verse of that one talks about forth then ye heroes, patriots and lovers. Isn't that the strange man that he was? Thank you. Hasn't it been fun, Sally?
It has.
Thank you.